Hi everyone, Janie here. Welcome back to my garden. We have been in this new property at this new house for 1 year now, 12 months. I can't believe it. Time flies. It went by so fast. And to me, it feels like we've only been here a month or two. But when I stop and I look back and I think about all the things that we've accomplished in the past year, it just makes me feel so proud and so happy. Now, for those of you who have been following along with our journey here, you know that it wasn't without hiccups. We have had some really great wins here at this property and then some really great losses or mistakes. But the good thing is that we have learned so much in this past year. I've learned so much about gardening. I've learned so much about myself as a gardener. And so for today's video, I thought it would be fun to go over 10 lessons that I've learned from living in this garden for the past year. So before I get into the lessons that I've learned in the past year, I did want to say one thing that I've said many times on my channel, and I feel so strongly about it. It warrants saying it again, and that is, you're not doing it wrong. This is my experience. This is my experience in this garden this past year, and it might be very different than your experience, and we're both doing it correctly. There's no right way in gardening and no wrong way in gardening. There's your way in gardening. And I just want to make sure that new gardeners hear that and seasoned gardeners hear that, because we get a lot of information thrown at us. And the important thing to remember is that gardening is supposed to be fun. It's supposed to be joyful. It's supposed to feed our soul, and we're not doing it wrong. So if I do a video on lessons I've learned, it's not trying to say that this is exactly the way to do it. This is just the way that I found that I want to do it. So I hope you all remember that you're not doing it wrong. So one of the first lessons I learned very quickly in this property is that soil is key, soil health in particular. And you can see right behind me, you can see a perfect example of how important soil health is for your garden. Over here on this side, we actually had compost. We had compost delivered to amend a whole bunch of soil in our garden, and we had it dumped over here on this side of our center island. Then we didn't have anything dumped over here. So this was all the native soil that was here before. And as we took some of the compost off of the pile over here, there was a bunch of it left, and I just spread it out. And so I had a couple inches of compost over on this side. And then I decided to do a cut flower garden. And the stark difference between this side where it was amended with compost and this side where it wasn't is absolutely incredible. And this is just one way to show how important soil health is. And if you move into a new property where the soil hasn't been touched for quite a number of years, you might have to amend your soil. There's a couple different ways that you can amend your soil, and you have to find what way works for you. What I found in this property that I am so happy, and it was such a win for me, is that the no-till method worked fantastically for me. Now, what the no-till method is you don't touch the native soil, you just leave it, and you leave all the microorganisms in there, and you don't till it up. You put about 6 inches of compost on top of it. If you have a lot of weeds, you can do a layer of cardboard underneath that compost, and then you put wood chips on top of that. And eventually all the bugs and the worms and the microorganisms is going to work that new compost into the native soil layer, and it's just going to enrich your soil and make it beautiful and exactly what we want to plant in. And in the meantime, once you do it, you have nice, beautiful compost to start planting in. So that's what I did in a lot of my property and the areas that I did the no-till method, and I added that compost and wood chips. Is absolutely beautiful soil, even down to that native soil. I have a lot of people ask me, once you hit the native soil, is it bad? No, because everything kind of gets mixed in, and the more time that passes, the better it's going to be. No, that was my experience. I found the no-till method was 100% perfect, and I will be doing it for the rest of my property. I will be continuing to amend my soil, continuing to add compost, and continuing to add wood chips. But you have to find what's right for you and your soil, depending on what soil type you have. But the lesson that I've learned in the past year is that taking care of your soil first and foremost is so important. The areas where I haven't touched the soil, for instance, my long border over here, everything is struggling and everything is dying, and it just makes me realize how important it is to take care of your soil first. All right, the next lesson I learned in my garden this past year is understanding your sun and your shade, and understanding that it changes as the season progresses. Now, I learned that lesson very, very quickly over here. This is what I call my secret shade garden. It is on the north side of my house, and I had big, big plans for this shade garden. I wanted it to be this cool, shady, beautiful area because I thought when I first moved into this house, which was in the fall, almost to the winter, I thought that this was a full shade area in my garden. I thought that the sun was going to be behind the house right over here. I have all these trees. I thought the trees were going to come and grow over, and I thought this area was going to have so much more shade than it actually ended up having. So as the season progressed this year and the sun got higher and higher in the sky, I realized that the sun tracks absolutely perfectly in between the house and in between the trees, and what I thought was a full shade to part shade garden is actually a full sun to part sun garden. And so all these beautiful shade plants that I had planted here have absolutely gotten fried over the season. And that is okay. It is a lesson learned. It is a good reminder to kind of wait, kind of pay attention to the trajectory of the sun over the whole year, and don't automatically assume some place is going to be full sun or full shade or something like that, because it can definitely change. So it was just a really good learning experience. I am a little bit disappointed because I was super excited to have this as a shade garden, but I am growing some vines up and over some structures, so maybe I'll have some more shade here one day, but for now, it's a sun garden. So I moved from an absolutely beautiful, mature garden into this place that had nothing. I mean, like literally no plants, nothing going on. And I was kind of discouraged at first. And I thought, okay, there's nothing pretty to show. What am I going to do? I better hurry up and get planting. Well, the lesson that I learned is that I needed to find the focal points in this property. I needed to find the focal points in my garden. And what I mean by that is I needed to find what was beautiful here and now in my garden. Now, when I started taking the time to look around and figure out what I thought was beautiful, I really realized even though there was nothing here, there was no color, there was no plants, there was still beautiful, beautiful things about this garden. For one thing, my sunset in the back garden with the neighbor's barn, it is just such a beautiful, beautiful sight. And I enjoy it every single evening with the sunset. And I love looking at that focal point in my property. Another focal point in my property is my beautiful orange trees. In the winter, in January and February, they're covered with orange fruit and have all the glossy evergreen leaves. And they are just some of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. And it's one of the things I love the most about this property. Now, when I had moved in, I had thought I had figured out my focal points. I had a stone swoop at the very front of the property in my center island, and in my last house I had a stone swoop as well. And so I thought, oh, well, that's going to be my focal point, that swoop up there, and it's going to be very similar to my old swoop. Well, turns out I didn't like that swoop at all. It didn't end up working. We ended up taking it out. And the zigzag planter that I was 110% sure I was going to remove as soon as possible ended up being one of my favorite focal points of this whole property. Once I had taken the time and I had planted it up, I realized that the zigzag planter, although it's funny and kind of quirky, it really makes this property, and it's something that is so unique and so recognizable, and it's just something that I love so much and is one of my favorite focal points on my property now. So if you're moving into a new garden or even your current garden, take the time to figure out what you love the most about the property, what your focal points are, and then what that can do is that can guide your planting or guide your plans of what you're going to focus on, because that's what we want to actually look at. So find the focal points in your property as soon as possible. So speaking of the zigzag planter, that takes me to the next lesson I learned this past year in this garden, and that is that plans change. Plans can change, and that's okay. Just go with it. I have a video on my channel where I state very clearly, mark my words, zigzag planter is coming out. And what do you know, 12 months later, I have no plans to take the zigzag planter out, and I really, really do love it now. So plans change. Just because you have a plan for something in your garden doesn't mean you have to stick to it. Our situations change, our taste changes, our gardens change. Plans can change, and that is okay. It's also something that I kept telling myself as I was planting up my garden. There's a lot of decisions to make, and where am I going to put this plant, and where am I going to put this tree? And it's just a good reminder to all of us that you can dig up a plant and you can move it. You can take down a structure. You can take down a greenhouse if you don't like the spot where your greenhouse is. You can move a garden bed. Might take a lot of work, but just knowing that plans change might make you feel a little bit better about making some decisions in your garden, because they're not be-all end-all decisions. Plans can change. On to lesson number 5 that I've learned in my garden this past year. And that lesson is that trees and structures like garden beds or gazebos or pergolas are super important. But it's also important to take the time to get to know your garden before you make some big decisions like that. Now, I know this is kind of opposite than the last lesson that I just talked about, that plans can change. Yes, plans can change, but I also think it's important to take the time to get to know your property before you start making big decisions like where you're going to plant a tree or where you're going to take out a zigzag planter. Had I taken out the zigzag planter right away, I would have missed the beauty and the joy that it's brought me. So I'm so glad I took the time. I didn't rush to take it out, and now I know that I'm going to leave it. They always say when you start a new garden, the recommendation is to get your trees in first, your trees and your winter interest in first. Now, I decided not to do that with this property just because I was so unfamiliar with this property, and I am so glad I waited, because the places that I had originally planned to put trees in this property are completely different than the places that I want them now. Now that I've had a whole year to garden in this space, to know the places that I want shade, to know the places that I want structure, now I'm much more confident in the areas that I do want to plant my trees. I'm much more confident in where and what kind of structures I want in my garden. And I just feel so much better that I waited a whole season and I got more familiar with this garden to make those big decisions. So yes, trees can be moved, but also give yourself the grace of time to get to know your property before you have to rush and get that kind of stuff in. So this fall for me is tree fall. I'm getting a whole bunch of trees planted. I'm so excited about it, but I'm also so confident about the trees that I'm choosing and planting and the spots where I'm planting them. I know that it's a place that I definitely want a tree, and I'm excited to get it in. Remember this guy? I'm sure you do. It's been in the back of all my videos this whole year. So the lesson that I learned this year is that you have to pick your priorities. When I moved into this new garden, the list of things that I wanted to get done was so extensive, and we realized very quickly that we couldn't afford to do all of it right away. So picking the priorities in your garden is super important. For one, just so that you know what you're going to be doing next, and for two, just so that you don't feel bad about not getting things done. This propane tank is such an incredible eyesore. It's front and center of our house. It is so frustrating, but the cost to move it is absolutely incredible, and we just couldn't afford it this year, and there were other things that we wanted to do before spending that kind of money on something like this. And so we made the decision to put off moving this propane tank into next year, and in the meantime we did some cheap DIY stuff to kind of camouflage it, like planting corn all around it, which I kind of love. The same thing for our fence around our property. Our fence is very old and it needs replacing, but just by painting it made such a difference and made it so that we can kind of deal with it until we get enough money to be able able to replace it. So the lesson that I learned is pick your priorities, focus on what you want to focus on first, and then everything else, just do a quick, cheap DIY to get you through. And don't feel bad about not being able to do everything all at once. For most of us, we don't have the financial situation to do it all at one time. So don't feel bad. Just do some DIY stuff, get creative, and just move on and focus on the things that you really want to focus on that year. So I'll be the first to admit the next lesson that I learned this past year was a tough one. It took me a full 3 months to finally register this lesson and to understand how important that was. And that lesson was to focus on one area of the garden at a time. Try and finish or try and work on one area at a time, and don't kind of spread your energy all over multiple different areas, because then you'll feel like you're not getting anything done. Now, this lesson was taught to me by Michael Glassman, the wise words of landscape designer Michael Glassman. He told me to really focus. This was such a big property, and it was super important to focus on one area at a time, so I felt like I was making progress. When he told me that, though, I kind of was like, okay, thanks, Michael, and then just continued going and working on absolutely every spot in my garden until I started getting really frustrated with the lack of progress. So then I focused all my attention and all my energy on this orchard garden, and it made such a difference. I started feeling really good. I started feeling really proud and feeling like that I was making some progress in this property, and that was because I took the time, I stopped focusing on other things, and I decided to focus on one area at a time. So it's a hard pill to swallow. It was a hard lesson to learn, but focus on one area at a time, no matter how much you want to go to the next area. And I'm pointing to my center island. No matter how much you want to go there and start working on that, focus on one area at a time until it gets to a point that you're happy with, and then you can move on to the next area. Okay, the next lesson that I learned in my garden this past year is a pretty common one that a lot of us need to learn, and that is the importance of being patient. And what I mean by that is my mantra for the past year. I've been telling myself this every single day for the past year, and that is sleep, creep, leap. Sleep, creep, leap is so important to remember, and it's just a reminder to us all to be patient. I planted this star jasmine espalier last year. It is one of the first installations I did, and it's taken a full year for it actually to start growing. So the first year of a plant is the sleep year. It doesn't grow a lot up above ground. It's growing a lot below ground. The second year is the creep year, where it starts creeping up and growing a little bit more, which is we're just getting into the creep year for the star jasmine espalier. And you can see it's growing over there. It's touching the top, and I'm actually starting to have to train it and prune it, and I'm so excited about it. And then the third year will be the leap year. I also have this clematis armandii growing up these trellises in my secret shade garden, or my secret sun garden. And I am so excited for them to get big and to grow and to make this whole area a living wall. But I just put them in this year. So we're still in the sleep year, and I'm just reminding myself to be patient. Don't plant more. It's doing well. Like, don't get impatient. Take your time, and it's going to start growing, and it's going to start being absolutely beautiful. I just got to give it some time, and I got to be patient. So my last house was beautiful. It had a beautiful garden. It had a beautiful house. It was formal. A lot of the plants that I had there, I had pruned. I had espaliered. I had topiaried. The way that I planted and the way that I decorated was pretty formal, and a lot of the colors were cool blues, cool grays, just a lot more cool colors. Now, I loved that, and it was absolutely beautiful, and I brought that aesthetic to this house, and I tried to implement that same aesthetic because I loved it so much, right? And it took me a couple months to realize that something was wrong. Something wasn't fitting, something wasn't meshing well. Anytime I put something new into this garden, it just didn't feel quite right. And I didn't realize what the problem was until I started listening to my house and listening to the property and listening to the garden. And I know this sounds very silly and very woo-woo, but I truly, truly think that houses, gardens, properties have souls of their own, and they will tell you what they want and what they need in your own property. So once I started listening to this garden and to this house, I realized that that formal aesthetic just didn't fit. Everything is so much more casual here. Everything is so much warmer here. Everything is so much looser here, like loose grasses and not so tightly shorn shrubs and trees. And then all of a sudden, everything started fitting perfectly. And I realized that the feeling of this house is so different than the feeling of my last house. And yes, I loved the decor and the style and the garden of my last house, but I also love this house too. And it's just different. And so I just learned you got to listen to your house. You can do what you want, but there is a part of the garden style and the decor style that needs to go with the property and needs to listen to the property as well. So listen to your property, listen to what it's telling you. Once you find the right thing, everything gets easier. Everything starts fitting in more beautifully. Everything is just what it's supposed to be. So the last lesson that I learned in my garden in these past 12 months kind of goes along with the first thing I said in this video, and that is that there are no rules in gardening. You're not doing it wrong. Now, what I mean by that is a lot of times we will hear some advice or we'll read an article about the right way to do things, maybe the right steps to do things in the garden, or what you should focus on first, or what plants you should plant, or anything like that. And what I'm trying to say, and the lesson that I've learned over and over and over again over the past year, is that gardening is supposed to be joyful. It is supposed to be something that's fun. It is supposed to be something that you love. And how can you love a garden if you're just following a step-by-step guide that somebody else has given you? So, there's a right way to do it, but sometimes the right way is not always as fun. And so just do what works for you in your garden. I think that that is the most important thing. So let me know in the comment section below the lessons that you have learned in your garden. I hope you all have enjoyed this, and I hope you have a chance to get in your garden today.